Less than 3% of registered voters cast a ballot in this year's Dona Ana County school board elections. Dona Ana County Deputy Clerk Scott Krahling says the lower the turnout, the less integrity an election has.
I mean, we have a democratic system, and in order for that system to work the way that it should, people need to show up and vote. People need to be engaged citizens.
Krahling acknowledges that New Mexico school board elections naturally have lower turnout because they're scheduled outside the normal election cycles. But even the 2014 November turnout of about 1 in 3 New Mexico voters was alarmingly lower than years before.
Every election, whether it's a general election or a school board election, we get phone calls that say, you all didn't do enough to tell people that there was an election happening. And one of my standard responses is, well, you know, we bought advertising, we did this, we did that, and they say, well, you should be doing more.
But in my home country, Australia, voter turnout isn't an issue. In Australia and most nations with top voter turnout rates, voting is more than a citizen's duty. It's an obligation, a legal obligation. In the last Australian election, voters showed up to the polls at a rate of 93%. Krahling says the Bureau of Elections does everything within its power and budget to get more Dona Ana voters to the polls, from public events like Election Fest to Spanish language outreach.
An election isn't just whether or not there's a location, whether or not there's poll workers, whether or not, you know, all the work is done correctly. An election is about people. It's about people showing up and voting.
As an Australian citizen overseas, I myself got a $50 fine for failing to vote or file an absentee ballot in a recent small local election. But it's a fine I'm happy to pay in the name of functioning democracy and a functioning country, because the positive effects of compulsory voting go much further than broader political representation and higher voter turnout. Compulsory voting can ease polarisation and even break political gridlock. Christy French is the Dona Ana Democratic Party chair. French says voters tend to be more indifferent to elections that are seen to be less consequential, like midterms. She says it's even more difficult to get Democrats to the polls as opposed to Republicans, who typically turn out in larger numbers.
Unless it's something that is really, really important to them or they really feel strongly about. And unfortunately, the voting public has proved to be pretty apathetic about voting and about what their vote means.
A 2014 Pew Research national survey found that political division is actually the greatest among the most politically engaged voters, meaning that this choosy, occasional approach to voting can actually exacerbate partisan politics and polarisation. But when voting is compulsory, people aren't just voting when they're fired up about hot-button issues like minimum wage increases, legalisation of marijuana, or gun rights. They're voting in every single election, and that can have a moderating effect on policy. Dona Ana County Deputy Clerk Scott Krahling says compulsory voting could resolve a lot of issues related to low voter turnout, but he's not sure it could be implemented in the US.
I think that there are a lot of people that are automatically skeptical of any sort of mandate that comes from the government, and that's the challenge. It's not necessarily that it's much different from being on a jury or buying healthcare. It's that anytime the government says you have to do something, there's a lot of people out there that automatically don't want that to happen.
He says there are a lot of reforms that could more easily be implemented to improve voter turnout, like consolidating elections, allowing mailed ballots, and allowing voters to register right up until Election Day. States with rates of midterm voter turnout above 50%, like Maine, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Oregon, all allow voters to register on Election Day or receive ballots in the mail. For KRWG, I'm Simon Thompson.